Well, welcome everybody to our show today. And I'm Joe Perfito. I'm the president of Clark's Cable and Tributaries Cable, and I'm joined today by Mark Spitz. Now, for those of you that don't know, have not met or known who Mark Spitz, Mark is an Olympian. He is had the number of gold medals, 7 gold medals, the most anyone had ever won up to 1972 when he won those at the Olympics in Munich. And he held that until 2008, until Michael Phelps was able to get 8 gold medals. So in addition to that, being a world-class athlete and Olympian, Mark is also an avid audiophile, and he will talk about that bit with the equipment that he has and what he's learned about audio over these years. And we're also joined today by Jason Lord, and Jason is the proprietor and owner of the Source AV Design Group in Torrance, California, probably one of the best stores to visit, audio stores on the West Coast. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. So today we're going to talk about all things audio, and our main subject today is going to be about the importance of retail stores in purchasing better audio equipment. But first, I'd like to talk about my acquaintance with Mark Spitz and how we became acquainted. I got a phone call. This is probably about a year ago. I got a phone call, and Mark introduced himself and said, "Listen, I'm interested in Clark's Cable, and I'd like you to tell me about it, and tell me about the Aqua series and the Crimson, what the differences are between the two." And we had that discussion, and I told him basically what I knew about the cables and what was important. And then I suggested that he give Jason a call, because Jason is a Clark's dealer in Southern California, and Jason has great knowledge of the cable. And since we don't sell directly to consumers, then we wanted Jason to be able to talk with them. So he did. He gave Jason a call, and Mark, you can take it from that point.
Well, thank you, Joe. So I did call Jason, and we started talking. He took my call graciously, and we found out that we had probably crossed paths back in about 1973. I had finished the Olympic Games in 1972, and I had a few dollars to spend on some improvement of my stereo that I thought we didn't even know what the word audiophile was back in those days. But I'd always had a nice stereo. I think my first receiver was like a Scott receiver, which was like a mid-brow. But for me, that's all I could afford. But SAE came to light, a company that was right there at the forefront. And Jason, as I later to find out, was involved integrally and intimately with that company. And so I bought the top of the line equipment and had it for a number of years. But after we exchanged the idea that we had come in contact with each other sort of indirectly, I guess back in the 70s, I said, most of that equipment never had anything that was cabling. I mean, I think the power cord was probably hot wired onto the chassis. I mean, we used unbalanced connections that probably were a bunch of them in the box that I had from, I guess, tape machines. And he said, no, we got to go a different direction. So I had a bunch of different equipment, and the show's not about the equipment I've had in between 50 years. But the fact is that Jason said, look, you could have all the best equipment in the world, but we got to now get you connected, and we got to get you connected with balanced connections, something that was never available to me at that time. So he stepped me through all of the intricacies, I guess, and all of the nuances of different brands and what can come to light. And I kind of told him, it reminded me of a story at the time. It'd be like a swimmer, you have fast swimming suits. And that was a thing of when Michael Phelps, you mentioned, had a bunch of they had all these one-piece suits. Somebody asked me, well, do you know the difference between the two brands? I said, yeah. He says, well, which one's faster? And I said, well, I'll give you an example. If I throw the suits in the water and the swimmers aren't in there, what swimsuit's going to win? I said, that's like buying a stereo equipment. To this discussion, you could buy the best equipment in the world, but you got to connect it. And if you connect it with bad cabling, that's probably what you're going to have. And so Jason took me through those steps and went down to a store, and it was quite amazing. It was a panacea of knowing how much I didn't know and how much I could know. And that was very exciting. And that's how we got into discussion, and I ended up with Claris Aqua, and I couldn't be any more excited about it.
Then, yeah, and that's when you called me and said, I can't believe those cables could make that much of a difference, Joe. What did you do? What are you doing there?
So what's the
And
magic sauce?
it was the magic sauce, right? And of course, we run into this all the time. I'm sure, Jason, you do too, where customers will say, well, cables, do they really make a difference? Is it really important to have good cables? And of course, we know what the answer to that question is. But Jason, tell us about tell us about your store first, and then tell us about what happens when someone comes in and they start, and you're presenting a system to them and the idea of cables.
So I think the easy way to explain it is I'm not particularly fond of salespeople. So what I wanted to develop when I first started the company was a way to demonstrate product that would help educate the consumer, so that the consumer was well informed and could actually understand things on their own without having some person put a sales pitch in front of them. So what we did was we created a store that has about a 10,000 square foot showroom. And so instead of saying, hey, buy this, but I can't show it to you, or do this or that, we just wanted to make sure that we had everything out there so that anybody could listen to whatever combination of things that were available here. The biggest thing was providing an education to the consumer so that the consumer could actually make an educated decision, and that makes it so I don't have to hire guys that are pushing people, do this, do that. Like I said, I'm not particularly fond of that aspect. But when you have an educated consumer and you point things out, they're able to discern these things on their own, and they say, oh yeah, I can see why that works good. It's just like cables. You take the $6 cable that, say, a Macintosh supplies or an Audio Research supplies, and you pull that out and you put a much better cable into the system. That person's going to be, if it's a power cable, that person's going to go, oh my God, what a big difference that is. If it's an audio cable, depending on how good the system is, it will still show its benefits. It just, in sometimes a smaller degree, if it's a less discerning system. If it's a more discerning system, you might hear a pretty dramatic improvement by adding a much better cable to the system. But cables can often be a person's bottleneck, because if you're using a cheesy cable, if you have a nice high-end system, you're going to have cheesy sound because you're only as good as the weakest link. So that's the reason why the Source AV is what it is, and it's like I said, it's an education facility. So we show people what things do, and then that person can make the decision whether or not it's, affordable in their pocketbook, or if it's something they really care about. Some people might say to me, hey, I'm only getting a little tiny nano improvement, but you're asking me for a budget on cables that is next to the cost of a Hyundai. And so that's their choice. I mean, they may say I don't want to pay $8,000 for cables, even though I bought a $150,000 system. And that's where they cut off their nose and spite their face, because that extra $8,000 might take them into, audio nirvana. But people do what they do. But yes, I'm a big fan of good quality cables. And I definitely think that your cables, all the way from the Tributaries end all the way to the Claris high end into the Crimson, are pretty damn good cables. And I think that relative to other brands, they're not astronomical on cost. Not always cheap, but not astronomical. They're not out of the realm of reason when you talk about the improvement to a system. So that's kind of who we are.
Jason, when you're talking with a customer about cables and the question of the cost of the cables in relation to the system, is there something you use maybe as a guide for a customer, like a percentage, where you might say, well, for a system that is, let's say it's a $50,000 system, we would suggest at least in cables, at least 15 to 20% of the electronics and speakers should be cabling. Is there anything that you do that in that vein?
So I don't necessarily put a dollar formula in it. But what I try to show people is that there is an advantage, and I show them what those advantages are and explain to them that if you really want the performance of a system, you're probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of the actual cost of the electronics,
Yeah.
relative to the, to the cable costs. And what you find is you have people that just go, yeah, it's cables, whatever. I'll just go ahead and do it without the cables. And then they come back to you a few months later and say, okay, what can I do to improve this?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not a bad way to go, only because if they tell me what their deficits are or what they're feeling that they're not complete on, I might be able to direct them to a cable that brings that back into their listening system. They might feel there's a deficit somehow, or there's too much of something, and we might get a cable that calms that down. An abundance of crispy high frequency that just you don't want there necessarily, and you want a good cable to smooth that out. But I do tell them that on average it's about 10-20% of
That's
the cost.
good. Yeah, that makes sense. We a store in Hartford, Connecticut, a stereo shop up in Hartford. They have a really cool display where they just have a little rack system that is on glass shelves with a Mac integrated amp at the top, and then a CD player below it, and a couple of speakers sitting on the floor. And it's wired up, but they have two power cables hanging over the rack on the back connector. They're just hanging over, and they'll have the a premium cable like our Series 8 power cable connected in, and they'll just sell a customer, hey, got a minute? Why don't you listen to this? Give them about 30 seconds, unplug the Series 8 power cable, plug in the stock power cord, and that's all it takes. The customer's response is, oh my gosh, I can't believe I can make that much difference. And, that's their way of indoctrinating right away a customer into the fact that cables are important. And if you do it right, you really can get an improvement in return on investment on the equipment that you're purchasing. So I think that was an important thing. Mark, where did you first, run into or come up with the experience of cables and how much of a difference they could make?
Well, I think it was back in 1990s. I was introduced to a gentleman that had this interesting concept of taking three wires and putting a negative at both ends of an unbalanced wire, and then with two guitar picks where you could actually slide the guitar picks back and forth that were actually bolted together, and that you could actually change the actual sound because of the interference of the wires. Now, these were Teflon wrapped wires, and the Teflon came from the overabundance of the space shuttle program. And they had just reels and reels of this stuff. And I had gone out and I'd seen this stuff at some place in the San Fernando Valley. And he had his company called Pure Logic. And so there was a dealer that actually was in Santa Monica, Optimal Enchantment, that introduced me to this guy and these types of cables. So he says, here, take a couple of these home. And I plugged them in and I thought they were really great. But I noticed that it made a big difference, because up until that time, I really just had nothing to speak of, no name, anything. I mean, Audio Quest wasn't even around. I think it was Monster Cable back in its day. That was sort of an interesting marketed device. But I think the power cable, in my experience over the years, has been the biggest improvement. And I think, Jason, you just mentioned that. It was one of the first things you just mentioned, that a power cable, just if that's the first thing that you switch out, can just unbelievably ignite your, your amplifier, and then everything else that's attached to it. And then everything else is up for grabs, like you just said, that music might be too bright and a certain cable might be able to tone that down or whatever. But I have a question to ask you, Jason. When somebody comes into your store, and I've been in there before, and it's quite overwhelming. When people come in, how much do they actually overbuy their budget because they get so enamored with saying, I have to have that amp because that's what I thought was the holy grail? And then a lot of them are coming with, I call their baggage, which is they probably have audio cables, be it Audio Quest or something. So I would think even, and I know from my experience, I didn't want to change my cables right away because I had the cables that I thought were providing my system that was pretty good. And all I had to do was just change the source of it and it would make much better, and I didn't want to take the time to understand about the cables until I finally got pissed off, to be honest with you, about the fact that my equipment became 20 years old. And I said, well, I've got to have an improvement about audio cables and everything like that. And that's what the phone call came a year ago to Joe. And that's how we started talking. So what percentage of people that come into your place are basically dragging their old cables and they're just reluctant to spend 1% of their budget to that? They want to have it all go to equipment.
So I think that it's a difficult question to answer. I think that people typically underbuy in that case. They'll put the money out for the equipment. They still have budget remaining, but they are reluctant to spend it on cables. And I think a lot of that has to do with there are people online who say you can buy a piece of 2-conductor wire for your speaker wire from Home Depot. It costs you $4.90 for a 25-foot roll, and that's fine. They're not understanding the science and they've never experienced a better cable. If it's a power cable, they don't understand how a better pipe, just like in plumbing, a bigger pipe can get more water down the pipe if you're talking about plumbing, right? So it's in power cables, the science and the gauge can make a huge difference. And so they're okay with the fact that the manufacturer will provide a $6 or $8 cable with their $5,000 amplifier because they think that that's what the manufacturer is recommending. The reality is that $6 or $8 cable is only there because it's already UL approved, and the manufacturer of the electronics don't want to go through spending $30,000-$40,000 in several months to get a better cable approved. So they just stay with a generic aspect of that. And the assumption by the consumer is that that's a good cable. It does connect it to the wall. It does give you power, but it doesn't necessarily give you the performance out of the power supply that you'd like to have. In tributaries, and well, not so much tributaries, but in part, but more on the Claris side, there is some science being used there that actually, as an electronic engineer, when I first read about what the Claris line was doing with their cabling, I was a little surprised in how it worked. Only because I had never thought of that before, maybe. But it worked particularly well. So I would have thought initially that, say, for example, on the Crimson, that the smaller gauge wire was the one that carried the high frequency rather than the middle gauge wire, which is the one that carries the high frequency more. And so just technology and science and physics lean you in certain directions as an engineer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a fact. The Claris stuff is a big surprise, and Jay, the guy that is the patent holder on some of that technology, I got to give it to him. I got to give him kudos on the design because it delivers. But better cables are always going to give you better performance. That's the bottom line. And there's a group of guys on the internet that will tell you the junk piece of wire is just as good as the expensive piece of wire, so don't buy the expensive piece of wire. That's just people being foolish. And it is what it is. There are cases where an expensive piece of wire is junk, and it's just all marketing, but, and I won't name names, but it's out there. But they are typically well-known brands, funny enough, and you name one of them, Monster. But it's some of that stuff out there is just not worth investing into. But if a hi-fi store can demonstrate to you that there's an abundance of improvements because you spent a little extra on the cables, then the consumer should pay attention to that because it's showing you that you're limiting your system if you don't do that. I don't know. It's people and what's important. It's kind of like somebody, you've seen my cars and you're a car guy. If you put shitty tires on a car, you're not going to get good traction.
Especially
so-
if you're going fast and trying to make a turn. And that's the essence of it. I mean, you could try
Yeah.
put shitty tires on a high performance car and still get from point A to point B. The point is that if you're going to do something out of the ordinary with that car, like you're on the highway and freeway and something happens and you have to you have to turn that wheel suddenly, and those tires blow, you're done. You're finished at 70 or 80 miles. You're finished. And I think the same thing would go for the cable. I mean, normal listening, background music, yeah, but you're gonna listen to your system, and it's got to be right. But when you talk about the power cables, one of the things people will ask me when I'm at a store or doing a presentation, how's it possible a 3-foot piece of wire plugged into the wall that's connected with Romex, going back to a circuit breaker? How's it possible that 3-foot piece of wire is going to make a difference in the sound? And I'll say, let me put it this way. Let me give you an analogy. I live in Florida. If I go to the faucet and I take a drink of water directly out of the faucet, it doesn't taste so good, But if I put a filter on that faucet and then drink it, it's very drinkable. And the same thing is true for that cable. What that cable is doing for that current that's flowing out of the wall to your equipment is the same thing that filter is going to be doing for the water that's coming out of the tap. And it's an analogy of, and it basically is true that that cable will have some filtering capability to get rid of that the imperfections that ride on that 60 hertz wave. That's the voltage wave. So if you can get rid of that grunge and those impurities, we're not going to remove buzzing and hissing. That's not the point. What we're going to do is remove the impurities that open up that window for the detail that we're not hearing because it's obscured by the impurities. So once we remove the impurities, all of a sudden, these details become noticeable and hearable. So that's how I look at, and sometimes I describe to somebody what the cable does. So okay. Great discussion. Thank you very much, Jason, for that. We appreciate it. And Mark, thank you also for your participation in our discussion today. And Jason, I look forward to coming out to seeing you at some point before the year is up. And also, I hope people who are watching this that live in the Southern California area will make a trip to Torrance and come and visit your store. You have the probably the best. I think it's the best. The best displays of Macintosh equipment on the West Coast, and all the other equipment that you sell, all the other brands that you sell are all top-notch, top-of-the-line, premium equipment. And I love your headphone presentation. Is really, I don't think there's another one like it in the United States. I think you do the best of any headphones, headphone amps, and DACs. So,
well, thanks, Joe. I think we try real hard to make it easy for people to understand and make a purchase.
great.
Jason, I'm sorry we don't have enough time, but you have the most interesting stories about your music background and that part of your career. And you're still associated, of course, with manufacturing in hardware, with source, with amplifiers, I know. So that'd be an interesting discussion to explore. And also leave us with a thought. We went to digital with amps maybe over the last, whatever, I'm going to get this wrong, say 10 years, to where it's an acceptable means of amplification. Where do you think the industry is going to take us with technology in the next 10 or 20 years?
So I think it's already taken a direction. So the idea behind digital performing amplifiers is less current draw, more output on the device. If it's an amplifier, of course, we're looking for more power delivery, more current delivery, so we can get a better sound and better dynamics out of the product. So we are headed into a world where, the straight up analog amplifiers are challenged by power consumption. So if you get a big amplifier that's pulling, your list at normal listening levels, you're pulling 6, 7, 8 amps off of a wall. That's quite a bit of power. Class A power amplifiers just pull massive current, and it's a very inefficient but a very good sounding way to do it. Class AB is where most manufacturers live. Class D or digital power amplifiers, they'll get there. They're not particularly good sounding yet, but we keep getting closer and closer all the time. So guys like Joe, who are building cables, are going to start building cables down the road a bit that are more that contain better synergy for that type of amplification. And so we're there. I think we're probably 5 or 10 years away from digital amplification being audiophile. But at your age and my age and even Joe's age, I mean, we come from a world where it was easy. When you get into digital, it's a whole different game, and it's sometimes very, very hard to get things exactly right. You know this, right, Joe?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
so it's a matter of, I think maybe 5 or 10 years really is when we'll start seeing really good sounding Class D or digital power amplification.
Well, that's what we have to look forward to. That's good.
Let's hope we live that long.
Well, we will. But the question is, will we be interested?
I don't think I'll ever stop being interested in cars and audio. What about you?
Well, I mean, it's a passion. It's somewhat of a hobby, and the friendships that you make along the way are sometimes very long lasting. And I think that the value that you have in your life is the people that you've touched and been in contact with that make you have a great experience. I mean, I had a great experience being at your place, and I've had a great experience talking to Joe quite a bit and what he's doing, and just being knowledgeable, I think, is important. How we use that knowledge is in the hands of the people that want to use it. And I think that your shop provides that opportunity for somebody to come in and say, hey, you can take them to the stars. The question is how fast they want to get there and how much they want to spend to do it, pretty much.
Well, so, I mean, I have the store set up the way it is because this is basically how I would like to deal with it. If I was a consumer and I wanted to get good advice and I wanted to understand things, I would want to go to a store like this only because it gives people an opportunity to learn and understand versus just hear the buzzwords and make a purchase. Like I said in the beginning, an educated consumer is the best consumer, because then you can just give them a point of contention or a point of advice, and you can physically show them what corrects things and what doesn't correct things, and you can help them get past the BS that is out there. And there's a lot of BS out there because everybody's kind of got widgets and blah blah blah. But in terms of Joe's company, Tributaries and Claris, these are high performing cables at a very reasonable price, and I'm an advocate for the product, and we try to show that product. We show a number of different brands of cabling, and some of them have different attributes, and some of them help resolve things differently. But again, so far, Tributaries has been my favorite out of all of them because they're not making your pocketbook hurt when you buy things typically.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jason. And I think this points up the fact of the necessity when you're purchasing, those of you who are listening to this presentation, the necessity to participate and go to visit an audio dealer if you're purchasing products that are what we would call, high performance type of products. In other words, you're not buying a boombox. You're not buying something that's just an ordinary type of basic receiver. If you're looking for good equipment and good speakers and good cables. Go to an audio dealer, because let them help you decide what's best for you. That's really the bottom line. That's what they do best. And Jason really demonstrates that beautifully as a professional. He's not there to raid your wallet. He's not there to raid your pocketbook. He's there to make you happy. And that's the important part. So, okay, well, gentlemen, thank you very much again. And we'll look forward to doing this again, and we'll have another presentation. And it should be within the next week or so. And I'll let you know when that happens. So Jason, again, thank you. Mark, thank you also.
Good seeing you guys
And
again.
We'll be talking with you soon.